I went to a flower shop to buy flowers for my wife's 65th birthday. When I walked in, the owner grabbed my arm, her face completely pale, and pulled me into the freezing back room. "Hide," she whispered. "Do not make a sound." I did not understand. 10 minutes later, my wife and my son-in-law walked through the back alley door, and what I heard them say next completely shattered my 35-year marriage. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to trust your gut and stand up to the people who severely underestimated you. I am Harrison Cole, 70 years old. Growing up in Texas meant I had to build everything from the ground up. I created a luxury auto and commercial real estate empire in Dallas with my own two hands, sacrificing sleep, comfort, and peace to ensure my family would never know the struggles I endured. My sprawling estate with its manicured lawns and quiet security was supposed to be my fortress. My wife Patty and I had been married for 35 years, portraying the perfect, devoted, high society couple. My son-in-law Derek, a sharp 40-year-old executive, was the chief financial officer of my company. My daughter Rachel was a gentle, devoted mother, utterly dependent on him. To the outside world, my life was an absolute triumph. But inside, a lethal trap had been set right beneath my feet. It all started on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. I drove my car to Maria's Bloom, a quiet, upscale florist, tucked away in a discreet corner of the city. Maria, a 55-year-old woman who had been arranging my anniversary and birthday bouquets for over a decade, knew exactly what Patty liked. I had ordered a massive arrangement of imported pink peonies to surprise my wife. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully as I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and fresh lilies. But there was no cheerful greeting. Maria was standing behind the counter, staring out the front window with wide, terrified eyes. When she saw me, all the color drained from her face. She rushed out from behind the register, grabbed me by the forearm with surprising strength, and physically dragged me toward the back of the shop. "Mr. Cole." "You have to hide," she stammered, her voice shaking. "Please do not ask questions. Do not make a sound. They are coming." Before I could demand an explanation, she shoved me into the massive walk-in floral cooler and slammed the heavy glass door shut. I stumbled in the freezing darkness, surrounded by buckets of iced roses and carnations. The heavy hum of the refrigeration unit masked the sound of my own heavy breathing. I was angry, confused, and shivering. I peered through the condensation on the heavy glass door, wiping away a small circle with my sleeve. Less than a minute later, the heavy iron door at the back alley of the shop swung open. My heart hammered against my ribs when I saw them. It was Patty, my wife of 35 years, dressed in her immaculate designer coat, and Derek, my trusted son-in-law. They did not look like two people running errands. They looked tense, looking around the empty back room of the shop. Maria had vanished into the front, leaving them alone near the storage area just a few feet away from the cooler where I was standing. For a fleeting, terrible second, my mind jumped to the most cliché conclusion: an affair. I thought I was about to catch my wife and my son-in-law in a disgusting, illicit romance. But as they began to speak, the reality proved to be infinitely darker, infinitely more sinister than any cheap romance. "Did you get the confirmation?" Patty asked. Her voice was completely devoid of the warm, matronly tone she used around our friends. It was cold, sharp, and impatient. Derek nodded, pulling his coat tighter around himself. "It is done." The notary took the cash. The new medical power of attorney is fully registered, and the $50 million Keyman life insurance policy has officially cleared the beneficiary update. Everything goes directly to the trust I control. Rachel does not suspect a thing. She thinks it is standard corporate restructuring. My blood ran colder than the air inside that cooler. $50 million. A fraudulent medical power of attorney. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of their conversation. "Good," Patty replied, stepping closer to him. "We cannot afford any mistakes, Derek. That naive daughter of yours will sign whatever you put in front of her, but Harrison is getting suspicious about the commercial real estate mergers. We are out of time. Do not worry about the mergers, Derek said dismissively. Once he is out of the picture, I am the acting chief executive officer. I will bury the paper trail. But you need to do your part. Are you absolutely sure the dosage is correct? If the coroner finds anything out of the ordinary, they will freeze the payouts and open a federal investigation. Patty let out a low, chilling laugh. A laugh I had never heard in the 3 decades we shared a bed. I have been swapping his heart medication for 3 weeks, Derek. The new pills are a high-dose beta blocker mixed with a stimulant. His blood pressure has been completely erratic. By the time we take him up to the lake cabin this weekend, his system will be exhausted. The altitude, the cold, and one final dose in his morning coffee will trigger a massive catastrophic cardiac arrest. It will look entirely natural, a tragic end to a long, stressful career. I stood paralyzed among the buckets of ice. My hands gripped the cold metal shelving so hard my knuckles turned white. My lungs forgot how to process oxygen. This was not a business dispute. This was not a greedy son-in-law embezzling a few $1,000s. This was a calculated, premeditated execution. The woman I had vowed to protect, the woman who had kissed my cheek that very morning, was methodically poisoning me. She was coordinating my murder with my daughter's husband, planning to slaughter me at my own lake house, steal $50 million, and leave my only daughter completely destitute and dependent on a sociopath. Just stick to the plan, Patty said, her voice echoing off the concrete walls of the back room. I will make sure he drinks his coffee on Saturday morning. You just make sure the local rural doctor is the one who signs the death certificate. No autopsies. We cremate the body by Tuesday. Understood, Derek replied. He checked his luxury watch, a watch I had bought him for his promotion. We need to leave before Maria comes back. I do not trust that florist. They turned and slipped back out through the heavy iron alley door, disappearing into the cold Dallas morning, as if they had just finished discussing the weather. I stood in the freezing cooler for what felt like an eternity. The cold seeped into my bones, but it was nothing compared to the absolute ice that had just encased my heart. 35 years of memories, family vacations, anniversary dinners, and shared laughter burned away in an instant, leaving nothing but ash. The heavy glass door of the cooler pulled open. Maria stood there, tears streaming down her face, her hands trembling violently. She looked at me with a mixture of terror and profound pity. "Mr. Cole," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I am so sorry. They have been using my alley door to meet in secret for months. I never meant to eavesdrop, but I heard them talking yesterday about the medication. When I saw you walk in today, and then I saw his car pull into the alley, I panicked. I could not let them see you. I could not let them know you were here. I stepped out of the cooler. I did not collapse. I did not cry. Something inside of me, the soft, forgiving father who always tried to keep the peace, simply died in that freezing room. It was immediately replaced by the ruthless, calculating businessman who had conquered the commercial real estate world. "You saved my life today, Maria," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You will not breathe a word of this to anyone. Not to the police, not to your family, and especially not to them. Do you understand?" She nodded frantically, wiping her eyes. I walked out of that flower shop without the peonies. I walked to my car, got into the driver's seat, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was 70 years old, a man who had built an empire, and my family thought I was just a clueless, aging obstacle waiting to be slaughtered. They thought they had the perfect plan. They thought they held all the cards. But they had made one fatal, catastrophic mistake. They had underestimated the wolf they were trying to hunt. I started the engine, shifting the car into drive. I was not going to run. I was not going to panic. I was going to let them take me to that cabin. I was going to smile at their dinner table, and then was going to systematically destroy their lives. I held my breath as the heavy metal door of the back alley clicked shut. Through the thick and foggy glass of the floral cooler, I watched the 2 people I trusted most in the world step into the dim light of the storage room. Patty. My wife of 35 years. She was wearing the beige cashmere coat I bought her in New York just last month. Right behind her was Derek, my daughter, and her husband, the man I had personally mentored and promoted to chief financial officer of my company. My initial thought, the one that made my stomach churn, was so painfully ordinary. An affair. I braced myself for the sickening reality of catching my wife with my own family. The absolute disgrace of it all made my jaw tighten. I pressed my back against the metal shelving, ignoring the freezing water dripping from the cut roses onto my shoes. I strained to hear through the loud hum of the refrigeration unit, preparing myself for whispered apologies. What I heard instead froze the blood in my veins. Derek paced the small concrete floor, checking his phone nervously. He looked like a man executing a hostile corporate takeover. Patty stood perfectly still, her posture rigid, her face completely devoid of the warm smile she wore at our Sunday dinners. "Did the notary clear the final signature?" Patty asked. Her voice was sharp, clinical, and completely unrecognizable. Derek nodded, slipping his phone into his tailored suit jacket. "It is done." The guy took the cash envelope without asking a single question. "The new medical power of attorney is fully registered, and more importantly, the Keyman life insurance policy has officially processed the beneficiary update." My mind struggled to process the words. Keyman Insurance. I had established that $50 million policy a decade ago to protect the company in the event of my sudden death. It was supposed to go into a locked corporate trust. "Are you absolutely sure Rachel cannot access it?" Patty asked, her tone dripping with genuine contempt as she spoke her own daughter and her name. "Rachel does not suspect a thing," Derek scoffed. "She thinks I am handling standard corporate restructuring. She signs whatever I put in front of her. The $50 million goes directly into the offshore trust I set up last month. Once he is out of the picture, I become the acting chief executive officer, and we divide the cash exactly as we planned." I stood paralyzed among the buckets of ice. My lungs refused to take in oxygen. They were not having an affair. They were planning my murder. And they were planning to rob my daughter blind in the process. "Good," Patty replied, smoothing out a crease in her coat. "We cannot afford any delays. Harrison has been asking too many questions about the commercial real estate mergers you pushed through last quarter. If he decides to call an independent auditor, we are both going to federal prison." Derek ran a trembling hand through his hair. "I have buried the paper trail as deep as I can, but we are out of time. You need to do your part. Are you sure the dosage is correct? If the medical examiner finds anything synthetic in his bloodstream, the insurance company will freeze the payout and launch a homicide investigation." Patty let out a low, chilling laugh, a sound so sinister it made the freezing air in the cooler feel suddenly suffocating. "I have been swapping his heart medication for 3 weeks. The new pills are a high-dose beta blocker mixed with a powerful stimulant. His blood pressure has been completely erratic lately. By the time we take him up to the Tahoe cabin this weekend, his cardiovascular system will be utterly exhausted." She took a step closer to him, her eyes completely devoid of the woman I thought I knew. "The altitude, the freezing weather, and one final dose in his morning coffee will trigger a massive cardiac arrest. It will look entirely natural. Just the tragic end to a long, stressful career." Derek nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Just make sure he actually drinks the coffee on Saturday. I will make sure the rural doctor in the local town is the one who signs the immediate death certificate. No delays, no autopsies. We will have the body cremated by Tuesday." "Understood," Patty said, checking her gold wristwatch. "We need to leave before Maria comes back from the bank. I do not trust that florist. She asks too many questions." They turned around and walked out the back door, slipping into the cold Dallas morning as casually as if they had just finished discussing the weather. I remained standing in the dark, refrigerated room. The heavy iron door in the alley clicked shut, sealing my fate. 35 years. I had spent 35 years building an empire, providing a life of absolute luxury, only to discover I was nothing more than a bank account waiting to be drained. The heavy glass door of the cooler suddenly pulled open. Maria opened the door, her face pale. "Mr. Cole, I am sorry," she sobbed. "I heard them planning yesterday. I could not let them see you." I stepped out of the freezing cooler. I did not collapse to the floor. I did not scream or cry. Something inside of me, the soft, forgiving father who always tried to keep the peace, died right there in that back room. It was instantly replaced by the ruthless and calculating businessman who had conquered the commercial real estate world. I pulled a thick stack of $100 bills from my wallet and pressed it into Maria's shaking hand. "You saved my life today, Maria," I said, my voice dangerously steady. "Close this shop for the week. Take this money and visit your sister in Houston. Do not breathe a word to anyone, especially not them. Understand?" She nodded her head frantically. "Yes, Mr. Cole. I promise." I walked out of that flower shop without the peonies I had come to buy. I walked out into the bright morning sunlight, feeling the warmth on my face but feeling absolutely nothing inside. I walked to my car, got into the seat, and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I was 70 years old. A man who had built an empire from dust and my own family thought I was just a clueless, aging obstacle waiting to be slaughtered. They thought they had the perfect plan. They thought they held all the cards. But they had made one fatal, catastrophic mistake. They had underestimated the wolf they were trying to hunt. I started the engine, shifting the luxury sedan into drive. I was certainly not going to run away. I was not going to panic or call the local police. I was going to play their game. I was going to let them take me to that isolated cabin. I was going to smile at their dinner table, eat their poisoned food, and look them directly in the eyes while I did it. And then when they felt the most secure, when they thought their victory was absolutely guaranteed and perfect, I was going to systematically destroy their pathetic, miserable lives. I drove through the towering wrought iron gates of my estate in Preston Hollow. The manicured lawns and towering oak trees usually filled me with a deep sense of pride, a testament to decades of relentless work. Today they just felt like the walls of a beautifully gilded cage. I parked my car in the expansive driveway and took a long, deep breath. The hardest acting performance of my life was about to begin. I opened the heavy oak front door, and the smell of roasted garlic and expensive wine immediately hit me. Our private chef had been preparing Patty's birthday dinner all afternoon. My daughter Rachel was in the foyer helping my 5-year-old grandson take off his jacket. When she saw me, her face lit up with that pure, innocent smile that had always been my greatest joy. She ran over and hugged me tightly. "You are home early, Dad," she said, kissing my cheek. I smiled, smoothing her hair. "I wanted to make sure everything was perfect for your mother," I replied. My voice was remarkably steady. Looking at Rachel, a wave of protective fury washed over me. She had no idea the man she slept next to every night was a monster. She had no idea her own mother viewed her as a weak, disposable pawn. I promised myself right then that I would shield her from the fallout, no matter what it cost me. We walked into the grand dining room together. The long mahogany table was meticulously set with our finest crystal and polished antique silver. A massive floral centerpiece sat proudly in the middle of the room, though thankfully it was not the bright pink peonies from Maria's shop. I had called my executive assistant on the drive home and firmly instructed her to have a generic high-end arrangement delivered instead, citing a sudden change of mind. 30 minutes later, the heavy front door opened again. The sound of Patty's cheerful laughter echoed down the hallway, closely followed by Derek's smooth, confident baritone. They walked into the dining room like royalty entering a grand ballroom. Patty looked stunning in a tailored emerald green dress, her hair perfectly styled. Derek wore a sharp navy suit, looking every bit the successful rising corporate star I had molded him to be. "Happy birthday, my love," I said, stepping forward. I wrapped my arms around my wife and kissed her cheek. It took every ounce of willpower in my body not to physically recoil. Her expensive perfume, a scent I had loved for 35 years, now made me want to vomit. She smiled up at me, her eyes sparkling with absolute affection. Thank you, Harrison, she murmured, resting her hand gently on my chest, right over my heart. You always make me feel so special. I looked at Derek. He extended his hand, flashing that charming, boyish grin that had convinced me to trust him with my company's finances. Good evening, Harrison, he said firmly, as we shook hands. Everything is looking great for the end of the quarter. I will have the final reports on your desk by Monday morning. I squeezed his hand just a fraction tighter than usual. I look forward to reading them, Derek. I really do. The absolute ease with which they operated was terrifying. There was no nervous sweat. There were no trembling hands or shifting eyes. They were completely relaxed, entirely comfortable in the skin of the people they were pretending to be. If I had not stood in that freezing floral cooler just hours ago, I would never have suspected a thing. We took our seats at the grand table. The chef served a flawless filet mignon paired with a vintage Bordeaux I had been saving for a special occasion. Rachel chattered happily about her upcoming charity gala, completely oblivious to the silent war being waged across the porcelain plates. I cut a piece of meat, chewed slowly, and decided it was time to test the waters. I needed to see their plausible lie in action. I set my silver fork down and wiped my mouth with a linen napkin. You two got home quite late today, I noted, casually, keeping my tone light and conversational. I tried to leave the office early to beat the rush, but I was stuck in terrible downtown traffic for over an hour. Where were you both? The dining room was quiet for a fraction of a second. I watched Patty closely. Her heart rate did not increase. Her breathing remained perfectly even. She reached for her crystal wine glass, took a delicate sip, and smiled at me with absolute chilling perfection. I was at the country club spa, darling, she said smoothly. The girls surprised me with a full afternoon package for my birthday. Deep tissue massage, facial, the works. I completely lost track of time. I turned my gaze to Derek. He was casually cutting his steak, not a single trace of tension in his shoulders. And I was stuck in a grueling banking seminar on the other side of the city, he added, rolling his eyes in mock exhaustion. Commercial loan compliance. It was incredibly dry, but absolutely necessary for the upcoming mergers. I apologize for being late, Harrison. I wanted to be here earlier to help Rachel set up. I stared at them. They had just flawlessly executed a coordinated lie right to my face without a single micro-expression of guilt. They had fabricated a spa day and a banking seminar to cover up a meeting where they finalized my murder and the theft of $50 million. The sheer sociopathy required to sit at my table, eat the food my money paid for, and lie to me so effortlessly was staggering. I felt a deep physical sickness settling in the pit of my stomach. It was the visceral realization that I had spent decades sleeping next to a predator. I nodded slowly, offering them a warm, understanding smile. Well, I am just glad you both made it back safely, I said, picking up my wine glass. Downtown traffic can be very dangerous these days. You never really know what is coming right around the corner. Patty beamed, completely missing the double meaning of my words. She turned her attention back to Rachel, asking about her grandson's school project. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of fake laughter and hollow conversations. I played my part flawlessly, laughing at Derek's corporate jokes and complimenting Patty on her radiant appearance. As the chef brought out a massive multi-tiered chocolate cake adorned with flickering candles, I stood up and tapped my silver spoon against my crystal glass. The entire room fell completely silent. I looked at the three adults sitting around my table. I raised my glass high. To Patty, I said, making sure my voice carried clearly across the large room. 35 years together. You have been full of surprises, my dear. May this weekend at the cabin bring us exactly what we truly deserve. Patty smiled, raising her glass in return. To us, she whispered, completely unaware of the approaching storm. The crystal glasses clinked together with a sharp, delicate ring that seemed to vibrate in the heavy air of the dining room. I took a slow sip of the vintage Bordeaux, letting the rich liquid coat my throat while maintaining eye contact with my wife. Patty lowered her glass gracefully, a picture of absolute serene devotion. Rachel, my beautiful, oblivious daughter, clapped her hands together in genuine delight as the private chef emerged from the kitchen carrying the magnificent chocolate cake. The chef placed it in the center of the table directly in front of Patty. The flickering light from the candles cast long, dancing shadows across the mahogany wood, illuminating the sharp angles of his face. He sat back in his chair, unbuttoning his suit jacket, wearing the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had outsmarted the world. I watched him closely, noting the subtle way he tapped his index finger against the table. It was a nervous habit I had recognized years ago when he was just a junior analyst pitching risky investments. He thought he was hiding his anticipation, but to a man who had spent decades reading opponents across boardroom tables, he might as well have been shouting his intentions. Rachel began slicing the cake, passing the rich, dark pieces around the table. The sweet aroma of chocolate and spun sugar filled the room, a stark contrast to the bitter reality suffocating me from the inside. We ate in a comfortable rhythm, exchanging small talk about the upcoming weekend. The cabin at Lake Tahoe was a sprawling, isolated property I had built years ago to escape the brutal Texas heat. It was surrounded by towering pines and rugged mountains, a place of peace that they now intended to turn into my tomb. As the plates were cleared, Patty wiped her mouth delicately with her linen napkin and pushed her chair back. She offered me a warm, tender smile that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I will be right back, darling," she said softly. "I have one more small gift for you." I watched her walk gracefully into the kitchen, her emerald dress swaying with each step. I took another slow breath, preparing myself for whatever game she was about to play. Derek picked up his coffee cup, taking a long, deliberate sip. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes focused firmly on his plate. A minute later, Patty returned. She was not holding a wrapped box or a greeting card. She was holding a small, amber prescription bottle. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my face perfectly slack, projecting the image of a tired, unsuspecting old man. She walked up behind my chair and leaned over, resting her hand on my shoulder. I felt the cold metal of her diamond wedding band brush against my neck. "Dr. Evans called me this afternoon," she explained, her voice dripping with artificial concern. "He reviewed your latest blood panels and said your cardiovascular system needs a little extra support before we travel to the high altitude at the lake. He sent over these new daily vitamins via courier. He said they are an experimental formula designed to strengthen the heart muscle and regulate your blood pressure." She placed the amber bottle on the table right next to my coffee cup. It looked completely ordinary. A standard pharmacy label bearing my name, the date, and the supposed instructions from my longtime cardiologist. "Take one capsule daily with food." I stared at the bottle. It was a masterpiece of deception. If I had not stood in that freezing floral cooler just hours ago, I would have swallowed the poison without a second thought. I reached out and picked up the bottle. The plastic felt heavy in my hand. I could feel the intense, focused gaze of both Patty and Derek drilling into me. The dining room was suddenly completely silent. Even Rachel had stopped talking, watching me with mild curiosity. I unscrewed the white cap and tipped the bottle. A single smooth white capsule rolled out onto my palm. It looked harmless. It looked exactly like a standard supplement. But I knew the truth. I knew that resting in the center of my hand was a lethal, calculated dose of a severe beta blocker mixed with a potent stimulant. It was a chemical weapon designed to brutally exhaust my heart and end my life. My thumb brushed against the smooth surface of the capsule. I looked up, shifting my gaze from the poison in my hand to the woman standing beside me. Patty was watching my face with an intensity she was struggling to conceal. Her eyes were slightly widened, her breathing remarkably still. Across the table, Derek was gripping his coffee cup so tightly his knuckles were turning white. They were waiting. They were holding their breath, waiting for the old fool to blindly swallow his own death warrant. The absolute cruelty of the moment washed over me. I wanted to stand up, shatter the bottle against the wall, and scream the truth until the crystal chandeliers shattered. I wanted to grab Derek by his expensive silk tie and throw him out of my house. But I could not. I had to play the long game. I had to let them believe they were winning. I offered Patty a slow, grateful smile. "You are always looking out for me, Patty," I said, my voice thick with manufactured emotion. "I do not know what I would do without you." Patty exhaled a tiny, almost imperceptible sigh of relief. "Just taking care of my husband," she murmured, stepping back to take her seat. "Drink it with your coffee, darling." I raised the white capsule between my thumb and forefinger. I brought it to my lips, moving slowly, deliberately. I opened my mouth and placed the pill inside. But instead of throwing it to the back of my throat, I swiftly pushed it deep under the side of my tongue. I immediately picked up my water glass and took a large, exaggerated gulp. I tilted my head back, swallowing loudly, making a show of washing the pill down. I set the glass down with a soft clink and wiped my mouth. The capsule burned against the sensitive tissue under my tongue. It tasted metallic, incredibly bitter, and utterly vile. My salivary glands worked overtime, threatening to dissolve the casing, but I kept my jaw locked tight. I forced my lips into a wide, relaxed smile. "There," I announced, patting my chest lightly. "Good as new. Ready to tackle the mountains this weekend." Derek let out a sharp breath, releasing his tight grip on the coffee cup. He leaned back in his chair, a smug, victorious smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Patty picked up her wine glass, her hands perfectly steady once again. She looked over at Derek, and for a fraction of a second, they quickly exchanged a look. It was a quiet look of absolute, terrifying triumph, a silent confirmation that the execution had officially commenced. Tomorrow morning, the real war would finally begin. I left the house at 5 in the morning, long before the sun had a chance to bleed through the heavy silk drapes of our master bedroom. Patty was still asleep, her breathing slow and rhythmic. I stood at the edge of the large bed for a moment, looking at the tranquil face I had kissed for 35 years, knowing the mind behind it was actively calculating the hours until my heart stopped beating. I slipped the dissolved bitter capsule from a plastic baggie in my pocket into a sterile glass vial. I did not drive to my corporate headquarters in downtown Dallas. Instead, I merged onto the interstate and headed north toward the Oklahoma border. I needed absolute secrecy. I could not risk using a local Dallas laboratory where my last name held weight, where a curious technician might recognize me, or worse, where Derek might have someone on the corporate payroll. The 2-hour drive was a silent stretch of highway. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel, my knuckles pale. Every mile marker that passed was another mile away from the illusion of my perfect life. I thought about the sheer volume of trust I had freely handed to them. I had given Derek the keys to my financial kingdom. I had given Patty the very best years of my life. I arrived at a private, independent toxicology and forensic testing facility just outside of Oklahoma City shortly after they opened. It was an unassuming brick building tucked away in a quiet industrial park, far removed from the glittering skyscrapers of my usual world. I walked in, paid a massive premium in cash, and requested a highly expedited chemical breakdown of the capsule. The chief toxicologist, a serious man with sharp gray eyes, noted the urgency in my demeanor. He told me it would take at least 3 hours to run the full-spectrum chromatography and isolate the exact compounds hidden inside the powder. I spent those 3 hours sitting alone in a sterile waiting room, drinking terrible black coffee from a cheap styrofoam cup. My phone buzzed constantly in my pocket. There were messages from my executive assistant asking about my whereabouts. There was a text from Derek smoothly asking if I needed him to cover my morning meetings. I replied to Derek with a short, carefully crafted message. I told him I was feeling a bit fatigued, likely just adjusting to the new vitamins Patty gave me, and that I would be taking the morning off to rest. He replied instantly, telling me to take all the time I needed and to let him handle the heavy lifting. The absolute sheer audacity of it made me grip the plastic armrests of my chair. He thought the poison was already working. He was eagerly anticipating my collapse. Shortly before noon, the toxicologist finally called me into his private office. He closed the heavy wooden door behind us and gestured for me to sit down. He did not look at me with the detached professionalism of a clinician. He looked at me with genuine, profound alarm. He placed a detailed printed report on the desk and slid it carefully toward me. He asked me, his voice very low, where I had obtained that specific capsule. I told him it was given to me by my wife, supposedly prescribed by my longtime cardiologist. The doctor shook his head slowly, his expression extremely grim. He explained that the capsule was absolutely not a vitamin. It was not a health supplement of any kind. It was a highly concentrated, meticulously crafted, lethal cocktail. The primary compound inside the powder was a massive dose of a specific beta blocker, a drug designed to aggressively slow the heart rate and drastically lower blood pressure. But packed inside the exact same casing was an equally massive dose of a powerful synthetic stimulant. He leaned forward, pointing a pen at the sharp chemical spikes on the graph paper. He explained the brutal, calculated mechanics of the poison. The beta blocker forcefully commands the heart to slow down, while the stimulant violently forces it to speed up. The cardiovascular system is essentially torn in two opposite directions at the exact same moment. The heart muscle becomes utterly exhausted, trying to process the agonizing, conflicting signals. Within 72 hours of steady daily ingestion, the immense physiological strain would inevitably trigger a massive catastrophic myocardial infarction, a complete and sudden heart attack. But the truly terrifying part, the part that proved just how deeply premeditated and brilliant this murder plot was the specific choice of these extremely volatile chemicals. The toxicologist explained that both compounds break down incredibly fast in the human bloodstream. By the time a rural doctor in a remote mountain lake town arrived to sign the death certificate, there would be virtually no suspicious chemical trace left in my system. It would look exactly like an overworked, highly stressed 70-year-old executive had simply succumbed to natural unfortunate causes. It was the perfect, entirely untraceable murder weapon. I stared at the clinical breakdown of my own assassination, printed clearly on the white paper in front of me. I thanked the doctor, took the confidential report, folded it into my inner jacket pocket, and walked back out to my car. The harsh midday sun was blinding, but I felt nothing but a dark, creeping cold settling deep in my chest. Patty and Derek were not foolish amateurs making a reckless, desperate mistake. They were cold-blooded, methodical killers executing a flawlessly designed operation. They wanted my $50 million life insurance policy, and they wanted complete control of the commercial empire I had sacrificed my life to build. I sat in the driver's seat, staring blankly at the brick wall of the laboratory building. My survival was no longer guaranteed by simply throwing the pills away. To completely defeat them, I needed to clearly know exactly why they needed me dead so urgently. The answer had to be buried somewhere deep within the corporate finances. I started the engine, shifting my absolute focus from surviving a murder to orchestrating a complete corporate annihilation. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, merging back onto the highway that would take me directly into the heart of my own company. I realized that my entire reality had been expertly constructed by people who viewed me as nothing more than a profitable stepping stone. The pain of my wife's betrayal began to recede rapidly, replaced by a singular burning desire to completely dismantle the future they thought they had secured. They believed I was just a blind, fading old man ready to bow out gracefully. They were about to discover the exact reason why I was the undisputed king of my industry. Every financial record, every private transaction, every hidden offshore account would be dragged into the unforgiving light. I pressed my foot down heavily on the gas pedal, accelerating toward the Dallas skyline. My legacy was not going to end in a remote wooden cabin. It was going to end with a brutal, unavoidable reckoning for the two people who dared to mistake my quiet generosity for absolute stupidity. I parked my car a block away from the Cole Enterprises building, It was 2 in the morning on a Thursday. The Dallas skyline was a towering grid of glass and steel sleeping silently under the heavy Texas sky. For 30 years, I had walked through the front doors of this building as a king entering his castle. Tonight, I was moving through the shadows like a thief in my own kingdom. I approached the side entrance, bypassing the main security desk. I still had the master biometric keycard, a small black square I kept tucked in my wallet. The security guard on duty was young, probably dozing at his monitor, completely unaware that the founder of the company was slipping through the executive elevator bay. The doors closed, and I rode up to the 40th floor in total silence. My heart beat steadily against my ribs. I was not afraid. The initial shock of Patty and Derek's betrayal had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, mechanical clarity. I stepped out into the executive suite. The plush carpets absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I walked past Derek's corner office, pausing for a fraction of a second to look at his frosted glass door. The man was a parasite feeding on the lifeblood of my life's work. I continued down the hall and entered my own office, locking the heavy mahogany door behind me. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I sat down at my desk and pressed the power button on my computer monitor, bathing the room in a pale blue glow. Derek had spent the last 3 years systematically modernizing our corporate cybersecurity. He brought in expensive consultants, instituted rigorous firewalls, and restricted access to the deepest financial drives. He told me it was to protect our client data and secure our assets from external threats. I had nodded along, playing the role of the aging founder who barely understood how cloud storage worked. I let him believe that I relied entirely on him to manage the technical infrastructure of the empire I built. What Derek did not know, what no one in the building knew, was that before he installed his fancy firewalls, I had my original IT director quietly carve out a localized hidden backdoor access port, a legacy super admin account hard-coded into the deepest architecture of the server. I had spent decades surviving in commercial real estate. I never handed the keys to my kingdom to anyone without keeping a master copy for myself. I typed in the IP address, bypassing the standard employee portal entirely. A black command prompt screen appeared. I entered my credentials, a sequence of alphanumeric codes I had memorized a decade ago. The screen blinked, processed for a tense moment, and then the firewall vanished. I was in. I had unrestricted, invisible access to every single file, ledger, and private communication in the entire Cole Enterprises network. I took a deep breath and opened the master financial ledgers. I did not care about the standard operational budgets. I went straight for the deep reserves, the commercial real estate acquisition funds, the war chest I had spent 20 years stockpiling to ensure this company could weather any economic depression. For the past 18 months, Derek had been aggressively pushing the board to approve a series of rapid, high-risk corporate mergers. He passionately argued during endless board meetings that we desperately needed to acquire smaller competitors to effectively corner the regional market. He presented slick PowerPoint decks showing projected synergy and exponential growth. I had been hesitant, preferring cautious expansion, but Patty had constantly whispered in my ear at night, urging me to trust her brilliant son-in-law. Now, looking at the raw, unedited ledgers on my screen, the sickening truth unspooled right before my eyes. The mergers were not about aggressive expansion. They were a desperate, frantic smokescreen. I clicked into the primary reserve account. The balance displayed on Derek's official monthly reports was $85 million. The actual verified balance on the raw server log was less than $12 million. I stared at the numbers, letting the magnitude of the theft wash over me. $73 million had simply vanished from my company. I began tracing the missing capital, pulling up the transaction histories for the past 2 years. Derek had not taken it all at once. He was far too clever and entirely too methodical for a single sloppy transfer. He had bled the company slowly, methodically. He had created a dozen dummy vendor accounts funneling massive consulting fees and phantom acquisition deposits into offshore holding companies. Every time a new corporate merger was formally proposed to the executive board, millions of dollars were deliberately flagged as non-refundable escrow payments only to be seamlessly diverted into black hole accounts in the Cayman Islands. The aggressive mergers were nothing more than a mechanism to generate chaotic financial noise. As long as the company was constantly buying, selling, and absorbing new entities, the accounting departments were too overwhelmed to notice the massive bleeding wound in the primary reserves. But Derek knew he could not keep the shell game going forever. I had recently mandated an independent third-party audit for the upcoming fiscal year. I remembered the exact moment I told Derek about the audit during a golf game 3 weeks ago. He had sliced his drive into the rough, his face pale. I had thought he was just having a bad day on the course. In reality, I had just signed my own death warrant. The audit would expose the missing $73 million instantly. Derek would face decades in federal prison. The pieces of the puzzle locked together with devastating precision. The fake vitamins, the $50 million life insurance policy, the fraudulent medical power of attorney. They did not just want to get incredibly rich at my direct expense. They needed me dead to stop the audit. If I died of a tragic sudden heart attack this weekend, Derek would automatically assume the role of acting chief executive officer. He would cancel the independent audit, use the $50 million insurance payout to quietly refill the decimated reserve funds, and emerge as the brilliant grieving son-in-law who guided the company through a tragic transition. Absolutely no one would ever know that he had stolen a single dime. He and Patty would have complete and unquestioned control of the entire corporate empire, the diverse real estate assets, and my beautiful daughter's future. I slowly backed out of the private server, making sure to clear the cache and leaving no digital footprint of my presence. I shut down the monitor and sat in the pitch-black office. The scope of their betrayal was absolute. They had planned to murder me to cover up a massive corporate heist, and they expected me to thank them for the poisoned pills. I stood up from my desk, my resolve hardening into solid, unforgiving iron. They wanted a dead man to solve their problems. I was going to give them a ghost that would completely tear their pathetic lives apart. I sat back down in the heavy leather executive chair. The pale blue glow of the computer monitor, illuminating the dust motes, dancing in the silent, darkened office. The initial wave of adrenaline had passed, replaced by a cold, deeply calculating focus. Derek had hidden the missing $73 million within the complex labyrinth of corporate mergers, but a sum of money that Massive could not simply sit in limbo. The capital had to be moving somewhere, channeled through financial accounts that he actively controlled. I cracked my knuckles, resting my hands gently on the keyboard. For the next hour, I dug through the encrypted transaction histories, tracing the quiet flow of capital from our primary corporate reserves into the various escrow accounts and then out into the ether. Derek had utilized a highly sophisticated network of digital routing protocols, masking the outbound transfer sources as consulting fees, legal retainers, and international market research acquisitions. But every single river of stolen money eventually flows into an ocean. I wrote a quick diagnostic script to aggregate all the outgoing wire transfers that deliberately bypassed our standard internal auditing software. The screen populated with a dizzying array of numbers and dates. I isolated the largest, most frequent transactions. They all shared a distinct digital fingerprint pointing directly toward a specific cluster of offshore holding companies. I bypassed another layer of Derek's superficial corporate security, accessing the raw banking data for our international subsidiaries. There it was, a sprawling, meticulously organized web of shell companies, all registered in the Cayman Islands. Over the past 24 months, exactly $15 million of the stolen reserve capital had been siphoned directly into these specific offshore trusts. The remaining $58 million was likely tied up in the pending corporate mergers, waiting to be officially absorbed into the system. But this $15 million was clean, untraceable cash already sitting in an isolated account waiting for them. 2 entire years. I traced the dates of the earliest outbound transfers. Derek had begun stealing from me within months of marrying my beautiful daughter. He had looked Rachel directly in the eye at the altar, held my hand warmly at the wedding reception, and immediately began constructing the financial architecture necessary to bleed my empire dry. I stared at the glowing screen, feeling a sharp, radiating pain in my jaw from clenching my teeth so tightly. He had played the role of the loyal son-in-law, flawlessly earning my absolute trust, while quietly building his own illegal fortune with the fruits of my life's work. But a Cayman Island trust requires an ironclad legal structure to function properly. It strictly requires an authorized signatory, a physical documented person holding the ultimate legal power over the stolen offshore funds. I needed to see the founding registration documents for these specific shell companies. I hacked into Derek's personal encrypted email archive, a secured external drive he kept hidden safely behind a complex proxy wall. It took me another 20 grueling minutes to crack the local access password, utilizing the birth date of his mother. A minor detail I remembered from a casual conversation we had years ago. The archive finally opened. I searched for the specific government registration numbers of the Cayman trusts. A compressed file appeared labeled simply as International Estate Planning. I clicked it open. It contained a scanned copy of the original incorporation documents for the primary shell company, the exact entity currently holding the stolen $15 million. I scrolled down past the dense legal jargon, my eyes scanning frantically for Derek's name. I found it on the final page, his signature scrawled boldly on the bottom authorization line. But it was the handwritten signature right next to his that made the air completely vanish from the executive office. My hand froze instantly on the computer mouse. My heart missed a painful, heavy beat in my chest. I leaned closer to the glowing monitor, refusing to believe the reality of what was right in front of my face. There, perfectly legible in dark black ink, was the elegant looping signature of my own wife, Patricia Cole. I stared at the screen until my vision completely blurred. Patty was not just a complicit, silent bystander in my pending murder. She was not just a greedy, impatient wife waiting to quickly collect the massive life insurance money. She was the ultimate financial mastermind, funding Derek's entire illegal operation. She was the official co-signer on the stolen $15 million. The sheer magnitude of this specific betrayal was entirely incomprehensible to me. A suffocating dark heaviness wrapped tightly around my throat, making it difficult to swallow. Why would my wife actively help my son-in-law steal directly from her own daughter? The entire corporate empire was ultimately destined to belong to Rachel. The vast wealth, the commercial properties, the family legacy, everything I had brutally sacrificed to build was meant to secure Rachel's future and the future of my innocent grandchildren. By secretly siphoning this massive amount of money into an offshore trust with Derek, Patty was actively, deliberately robbing her only biological child. It defied all known logic. It defied every fundamental maternal instinct in the human world. The cold, ruthless calculation required for a mother to secretly conspire with her son-in-law, to execute her husband, and steal her own daughter's rightful inheritance was a terrifying level of evil I had never encountered in all my decades of cutthroat business. I leaned back in the heavy chair, rubbing my burning, exhausted eyes. There was a vital missing piece to this sickening puzzle, a massive, horrific secret that inextricably connected Patty and Derek in a way that completely excluded Rachel and me from the equation. They were absolutely not secret lovers. The strange dynamic I had personally witnessed while hiding in the freezing floral cooler was not romantic in nature. It was purely transactional, deeply conspiratorial, and disturbingly familiar. Whatever dark truth bound them together was far stronger than a simple marriage and significantly deadlier than basic greed. I could not fight this war using standard corporate tactics. I needed aggressive outside help to completely uncover the absolute truth and prepare the battlefield for my survival. I reached for my phone on the desk and dialed the only man in Dallas I could trust to orchestrate a war of this terrifying magnitude. The phone rang twice before a gruff, tired voice answered on the other end of the secure line. It was Jonathan Briggs, my private attorney and personal fixer. He was a man who specialized in making massive corporate problems quietly disappear into the night. I did not bother with pleasantries or formal greetings. I told him to meet me at the abandoned commercial lot on the south side of the city in exactly 1 hour. I told him to come entirely alone and to ensure he was not being followed by anyone. I hung up the phone and looked back at the glowing computer screen one last time. The elegant signature of the woman I loved stared back at me, a silent testament to a lifetime of carefully constructed lies. I pulled a small encrypted flash drive from my pocket and swiftly downloaded every single document ledger and offshore transaction record. I needed the undeniable proof secured before Derek ever noticed the digital breach. I removed the drive, shut down the proxy server, and restored the firewalls to their original pristine condition. I walked out of the office ready to burn my empire down to save my daughter. I drove away from the towering glass structure of Cole Enterprises, leaving my legacy behind in the dark. The city of Dallas was slowly waking up the eastern horizon, bleeding a faint, bruised purple. I navigated my car toward the desolate industrial outskirts on the south side of the city. I bypassed the manicured suburbs and the bustling commercial districts, seeking a place where shadows still clung to the crumbling concrete. I pulled into an abandoned warehouse lot. The cracked asphalt was choked with overgrown weeds, and the skeletal remains of a forgotten factory loomed against the pale morning sky. It was the perfect place for a ghost meeting. I turned off the engine and sat in the profound silence. 10 minutes later, a sleek, unmarked black sedan rolled slowly onto the lot. The headlights cut through the morning mist, illuminating the decay around me. The car parked parallel to mine, facing the opposite direction, so the driver window aligned with my own. The tinted glass glided down with a soft mechanical hum, revealing the sharp, unyielding features of Jonathan Briggs. Jonathan was 60 years old, a man carved from absolute pragmatism. He was not just my private attorney, he was my fixer. For 20 years, he had operated in the murky gray areas of corporate law, making massive, complicated liabilities quietly vanish. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, his silver hair neatly combed back, his expression as unreadable as ever. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer empty pleasantries. He simply looked at me, recognizing the cold, hollow exhaustion in my eyes. "You look like a man who has just watched his own funeral." Harrison Jonathan said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely disturbed the quiet air around us. "I wish it were only that simple, Jonathan," I replied, my voice steady, stripped of all emotion. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the thick manila envelope containing the expedited toxicology report. I passed it through the open windows. "Read it carefully," I instructed. Jonathan turned on the small reading light in his vehicle. He pulled the crisp white papers from the envelope. I watched his eyes scan the dense chemical breakdowns and the terrifying conclusion drafted by the forensic toxicologist. For a man who made a lucrative career out of handling corporate disasters, Jonathan rarely showed surprise. But as he read the description of the lethal beta blocker and the potent synthetic stimulant, his jaw tightened into a hard, unforgiving line. "This is not a careless mistake with a prescription," Jonathan murmured, his eyes never leaving the page. "This is a highly sophisticated, meticulously engineered chemical weapon. It is designed to induce massive, untraceable heart failure." "Who handed you this poison?" "Harrison." "My wife," I said flatly. "Patty gave it to me last night after dinner. She told me my cardiologist sent it over to prepare me for the altitude at the lake cabin this weekend." Derek was sitting right across the table watching me swallow it, or at least watching me pretend to swallow it. Jonathan slowly lowered the papers. He looked at me, the brutal reality of the situation settling heavily between us. "Your wife and your chief financial officer are actively conspiring to assassinate you," he stated, stripping away any lingering illusions. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out the encrypted flash drive I had loaded in my office just an hour prior. I held the small piece of plastic up in the pale, cold light of the early morning sun. "The attempted murder is merely the final step in their operation," I told him, handing the drive across the gap between our cars. "I breached the master server an hour ago using the legacy admin protocols. That drive contains the complete, unedited transaction history of our primary corporate reserves for the last 2 years. Derek has systematically drained $73 million from our accounts. He has been pushing those aggressive real estate mergers specifically to cover the missing capital." Jonathan took the drive, his grip firm. "Where did the money go?" he asked, sliding it into his dark pocket. $15 million is currently sitting in a network of untouchable shell companies in the Cayman Islands," I explained, feeling the familiar burning rage flare in my chest. "The rest is tangled in phantom escrow accounts waiting to be officially absorbed when the mergers close. But that is not the worst part, Jonathan. I pulled the incorporation documents for the primary offshore trust. The authorized signatory for the stolen $15 million is not just Derek. Patty signed the documents right next to him. She is the financial mastermind funding the entire heist." Jonathan leaned back in his comfortable leather seat, tapping his fingers thoughtfully against the steering wheel. "This elevates the situation from a standard corporate embezzlement case to a highly organized, lethal conspiracy. They want the key man life insurance policy to cover the remaining deficit, and they want complete, uncontested control of your empire. But it makes no logical sense. The entire estate is destined to go to Rachel. Why would Patty deliberately orchestrate a massive theft that directly robs her own biological daughter? That is exactly why we are sitting in this abandoned lot," I said, leaning closer to the window. "I need you to execute 2 absolute directives, Jonathan. We are going to build a trap they cannot possibly escape, and we are going to tear their entire foundation down to the absolute bedrock." "Tell me what you need," he replied instantly, shifting into a purely operational mindset. "First, I said my words sharp and deliberate. You will draft a new, irrevocable blind trust today. I want every single asset I own, my corporate voting rights, the real estate portfolio, the liquid capital, and the personal properties transferred entirely into this trust. You will name Rachel as the sole uncontested beneficiary, but you will immediately bury a specific ironclad poison pill clause deep within the legal framework." "What kind of clause?" Jonathan asked, already pulling a sleek digital notepad from his center console. "If I die from any sudden unexpected medical event, the entire trust freezes completely for 20 years, I instructed. Rachel will receive a modest monthly stipend to care for the children, but the primary capital cannot be touched, moved, or leveraged by anyone. Specifically, it completely locks out any current or future spouses. If my heart stops beating this weekend, Derek and Patty will not inherit a single miserable dime. The $50 million insurance payout will be locked away in a vault they can never open." Jonathan nodded, his fingers moving rapidly across the screen. "It is ruthless, and it is brilliant. It completely neutralizes their financial motive for the murder." "What is the second directive?" "The second directive is far more complicated," I said, the cold morning air biting at my face. "I need you to dig deeply into Patty's life. Not her life with me, but her deep past. I want to know absolutely everything about Patricia Cole before she met me 35 years ago. I want the total, absolute truth." Jonathan stared at me through the open window of his sedan, his sharp eyes assessing the sheer gravity of my request. He did not ask any further questions. He simply gave a curt, professional nod, put his car in gear, and told me to be at his private downtown office by 3 o'clock that afternoon. As his car disappeared into the morning mist, I felt a strange sense of profound relief wash over me. The betrayal still burned like a physical wound in my chest, but the paralyzing shock was gone. I was back in my element. I was orchestrating a counterattack against the greatest threat I had ever faced. I arrived at Jonathan's office exactly on time. It was a highly secure, soundproof suite located on the top floor of a massive skyscraper, far away from the corporate headquarters of Cole Enterprises. When I walked through the heavy wooden doors, Jonathan had already assembled his elite team of estate lawyers and forensic accountants. The grand conference table was covered in thick stacks of legal parchment property deeds and corporate holding documents. For the next 5 hours, we meticulously dismantled the financial architecture of my entire life. We were not merely transferring assets out of my name. We were building an impenetrable fortress around my daughter, constructing walls of paper and ink that no predator could ever scale. Jonathan started with the commercial real estate portfolio. He drafted the framework for an irrevocable blind trust, a legal entity so dense and complex that it would take an army of federal litigators a decade to untangle it. I signed away my absolute ownership of the high-rise office buildings, the sprawling shopping centers, and the lucrative industrial parks I had spent my entire adult life acquiring. We moved every single voting share of Cole Enterprises directly into the new trust. I deliberately stripped myself of all executive power on paper, leaving me as nothing more than a figurehead while granting the trust complete absolute control over the company board. Next came the liquid capital and the personal properties. I transferred the deeds to the Preston Hollow estate, the private jet, the offshore reserves I had reclaimed, and the Tahoe cabin itself. Every dollar I had ever earned, every ounce of equity I possessed, was funneled into this newly created vault. The sole uncontested beneficiary of this massive financial monolith was Rachel. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that she was suddenly one of the wealthiest women in the state of Texas. But wealth without protection is just a target. Derek had already proven how easily he could manipulate Rachel, how effortlessly he could forge signatures and divert funds. If I simply handed her the empire, Derek would drain it dry within a month of my funeral. That was where the absolute genius of Jonathan's poison pill clause came into play. Jonathan stood at the head of the conference table reading the specific language of the clause aloud to ensure it met my exact ruthless specifications. The terms were brutally absolute. Upon my death, if the cause was deemed sudden, unexpected, or the result of a sudden medical event, the entire trust would immediately plunge into a mandatory 20-year deep freeze. Rachel would receive a generous but strictly controlled monthly stipend, enough to comfortably raise her children, pay for their education, and maintain her standard of living. However, she would have absolutely no access to the primary capital. She could not sell the commercial properties. She could not liquidate the stock. She could not borrow against the company assets. More importantly, the trust contained a titanium-clad exclusionary provision regarding spouses. Jonathan had drafted the language specifically to build an invisible electric fence around Derek. Even if Derek manipulated Rachel, even if he legally demanded access to her inheritance, the trust strictly prohibited any funds from being transferred to, managed by, or utilized for the benefit of a spouse or mother. Patty was explicitly named in the exclusionary documents. They were legally completely severed from my wealth forever. If I died this weekend at the lake cabin, Derek and Patty would automatically assume they had won. They would smile at my memorial service, play the roles of the grieving widow and the supportive son-in-law, and then rush to the bank to collect their $50 million prize. But when they attempted to execute their fraudulent documents, they would hit a solid brick wall. They would discover that the $50 million life insurance policy had been irrevocably reassigned to the frozen trust. They would find out that the company reserves were entirely locked down. They would realize with horrifying clarity that they had successfully committed murder for absolutely nothing. They would be left with a multi-million-dollar tax burden on properties they could not sell and a lifestyle they could no longer afford to maintain. I sat at the polished conference table, a heavy gold pen resting in my hand. I looked at the final stack of documents waiting for my signature. This was the point of no return. Once I signed these papers, I was legally surrendering the empire I had built with my own blood and sweat. I was officially a man without a net. But thinking about Rachel, thinking about the innocent smile she gave me in the foyer just the night before, made the decision the easiest one I had ever made in my life. I signed my name 32 times. With every stroke of the pen, I felt the invisible chains connecting me to Patty and Derek snapping one by one. I was cutting off their oxygen supply, choking their greedy ambitions, before they even realized they were suffocating. Jonathan collected the documents, checking each signature with meticulous precision. He placed the heavy files into a secure briefcase and locked it with a sharp, satisfying click. "It is done, Harrison," he said quietly. "The trust is fully active as of this exact moment. Your assets are locked behind a legal firewall that nobody can breach. The poison pill is live. If anything happens to you, Derek and Patty will spend the rest of their miserable lives staring at a vault they can never open." I stood up from the heavy leather chair, feeling lighter than I had in years. The financial guillotine was primed, the blade pulled all the way to the top, just waiting for the executioners to gladly position their own necks on the chopping block. The money was safe. Rachel was protected. Now all I had to do was convince them that their murderous plan was working perfectly. I thanked Jonathan and his legal team, buttoned my suit jacket, and walked out of the high-rise office building. The late afternoon sun was casting long, deep shadows across the bustling Dallas streets. I checked my reflection in the polished glass of the lobby doors. I needed to look tired. I needed to look like a man whose heart was slowly failing. The hardest acting performance of my life was officially underway, and the curtain was about to finally rise on my ultimate, long-awaited, and truly absolute revenge. I drove back to the Preston Hollow estate, the sprawling mansion that had been my sanctuary and was now the primary stage for the greatest deception of my life. I parked my car in the wide, circular driveway, taking a long, deep breath before opening the heavy oak front door. The house was quiet, the late afternoon light filtering through the tall windows. I immediately slouched my shoulders, allowing my posture to visibly crumble. I let my breathing become shallow and slightly labored, forcing a subtle wheeze into my throat. When I walked into the grand kitchen, Patty was standing by the marble island, arranging a vase of fresh white lilies. She turned to look at me, and I made sure my face conveyed a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. I reached out, gripping the edge of the granite counter, as if my legs were struggling to support my weight. "Harrison, darling, you look absolutely terrible," Patty said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet concern that made my stomach churn. She rushed over to my side, placing a cool, manicured hand on my forehead. I leaned into her touch, playing the role of the frail, ailing husband to absolute perfection. I told her I was just feeling incredibly drained, that the stress of the upcoming corporate audit was taking a physical toll on my heart. I forced a small, pathetic cough, pressing my hand against my chest. "You are pushing yourself much too hard, my love," she murmured, guiding me gently toward the plush living room sofa. "You need to rest. Did you remember to take your new vitamins this morning?" I nodded slowly, letting my head loll back against the cushions. "Yes," I whispered, my voice intentionally weak and raspy. "I took them right after breakfast. They always make me feel a bit strange at first, but I am sure they will help." I watched her eyes carefully. Beneath the mask of the doting wife, I saw a sharp, electrifying flash of pure victory. She adjusted the blanket over my knees, her movements deliberate and soothing, entirely unaware that the man sitting in front of her possessed the legal power to instantly render her penniless. She brought me a glass of iced water, and I made sure my hand trembled violently as I reached for it. The ice clinked loudly against the crystal glass. The physical exertion required to consciously fake my own physiological deterioration was immense. I had to actively remember to keep my heart rate seemingly erratic, to pause for breath in the middle of my sentences, and to project an aura of total vulnerability. The next morning, I carried the performance directly into the executive suites of Cole Enterprises. I walked past the receptionist's desk with a slow, shuffling gait. When I entered the boardroom for the morning executive briefing, Derek was already sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, confidently reviewing a stack of quarterly reports. I took my usual seat, intentionally dropping my leather briefcase onto the floor with a loud, clumsy thud. Derek looked up, his eyes locking onto me with the intense predatory focus of a hawk spotting a wounded animal. "Harrison, are you feeling all right today?" Derek asked, his voice projecting a smooth, polished layer of professional concern for the benefit of the other executives in the room. "You look a little pale." I poured myself a cup of black coffee from the silver carafe on the table. I focused all my energy into my right hand, forcing it to shake so severely that the dark liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the pristine white saucer. I let out a frustrated, exhausted sigh, pulling a handkerchief from my pocket to wipe up the mess. "I am fine, Derek," I said, forcing my breath to catch slightly. "Just a minor spell of fatigue. We have a lot of heavy lifting to do before the independent audit begins next month. I want to make sure the primary reserve accounts are perfectly reconciled." I watched him flinch. It was a microscopic movement, a tiny tightening of his jaw, but I caught it. Mentioning the audit was like pressing a hot iron directly against his skin. He quickly recovered, flashing a brilliant, reassuring smile. "Do not worry about the audit, Harrison," Derek said smoothly, leaning forward and steepling his fingers. "I have the accounting department running double shifts. Everything is entirely under control. You should focus on your health. We need you strong and rested for the board retreat at the mountain cabin this weekend." I nodded gratefully, playing the role of the relieved, trusting mentor. That evening, we all gathered for a formal family dinner at the estate. Rachel arrived with the children, filling the house with laughter and chaotic energy. I sat at the head of the grand dining table, surrounded by the people who defined my existence. Rachel sat to my left, happily cutting up food for my young grandson. Patty sat to my right, pouring expensive red wine into crystal goblets. Derek sat directly across from me, playing the perfect host, charming my daughter, and engaging the children. Throughout the meal, I continued my dying swan act. I ate very little, pushing the roasted vegetables around my plate with a trembling fork. I rubbed my chest periodically, wincing, as if experiencing sudden, sharp pains. Every time I exhibited a symptom of physical distress, I caught Patty and Derek exchanging rapid, silent glances. It was a highly sophisticated, unspoken language of murder. A raised eyebrow from Derek, a subtle, affirming nod from Patty. They were communicating across the table, silently confirming that the lethal chemical cocktail was successfully destroying my cardiovascular system. They believed I was fading fast. They thought the massive doses of beta blockers and synthetic stimulants were ravaging my heart muscle, preparing me for the final, catastrophic myocardial infarction they had meticulously planned for the isolated cabin trip. The sheer arrogance of their confidence was staggering. They sat in the house I bought, drinking the wine I paid for, silently celebrating my impending execution. But beneath my carefully constructed facade of physical weakness, my mind was operating with terrifying clarity. I was not the prey in this scenario. I was the apex predator, perfectly camouflaged in the tall grass, watching my targets gleefully wander directly into the kill zone. The irrevocable blind trust was fully active. The $73 million theft was entirely documented. The Cayman Island offshore accounts linking Patty to the embezzlement were secured on an encrypted flash drive resting heavily in my inner pocket. I held every single card in the deck, yet I sat there pretending to fold. Rachel looked over at me, her eyes filled with genuine, heartbreaking concern. "Dad, you really do not look well tonight," she said softly, reaching out to touch my arm. "Are you sure you are up for the drive to the cabin tomorrow?" I looked at my beautiful daughter, the only truly innocent person sitting at the table. I placed my hand over hers, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "I am fine," I whispered, smiling. "This weekend will definitely be unforgettable for all of us." The next morning dawned with a deceptive, cheerful brightness. Patty was up early, humming a soft tune as she moved around the master bedroom, packing her designer bags. She leaned over the bed, kissing my cheek with that familiar, practiced affection. She told me she was heading out to the upscale boutiques in Highland Park to buy some last-minute supplies and luxury provisions for our weekend at the mountain cabin. She gently ordered me to stay in bed, to rest my failing heart, and to let her handle all the strenuous preparations. I promised her I would not move a single muscle until she returned. I listened to the sharp click of her heels retreating down the grand staircase, followed by the heavy thud of the front door closing. I waited exactly 2 minutes. I listened to the low purr of her Mercedes sedan rolling down the long, circular driveway and fading onto the main road. The moment the sound vanished, my feigned exhaustion evaporated instantly. I threw back the heavy silk duvet, stood up, and pulled my encrypted cell phone from the inside pocket of my jacket, hanging over the chair. I dialed a dedicated secure line. Jonathan Briggs answered on the first ring. I told him the target had officially left the premises and the perimeter was completely clear. He simply said they were coming in. Less than 5 minutes later, a plain, unmarked utility van pulled into my driveway, parking out of sight from the main road. 4 men stepped out. They did not wear uniforms or carry bulky toolboxes. They wore casual, unassuming clothes and carried sleek, hard-shell briefcases. They moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency that spoke of deep military or intelligence backgrounds. Jonathan had personally vetted this covert security team, guaranteeing they were the absolute best in the private sector. I let them through the side service entrance. The team leader, a stoic man with sharp eyes, gave me a brief nod before deploying his men throughout the massive estate. They worked with staggering speed and precision. I watched as they systematically dismantled wall outlets, removed the covers of smoke detectors, and accessed the ventilation grates. They were installing microscopic state-of-the-art live feed cameras and highly sensitive audio transmitters in every critical sector of my home. They wired the grand living room, the formal dining room, where the conspirators exchanged their silent, deadly glances, and the kitchen. They placed a pinhole camera directly above the marble island where Patty had casually arranged her flowers while plotting my assassination. I directed the team leader to Patty's private study, a room I rarely entered. He disabled her lock in seconds, planting an invisible audio bug inside the base of her desk lamp. They even wired the master bedroom, hiding a lens within the ornate molding of the ceiling. I wanted every single lie, every whispered conversation, and every treacherous movement permanently captured and stored on a secure, encrypted cloud server that only Jonathan and I could ever access. As the team meticulously reconstructed my living room, Jonathan called me back with an operational update. His gravelly voice was tight with focused intensity. He informed me that the secondary phase of our infiltration had been successfully executed during the darkest hours of the early morning. While Derek was sleeping comfortably in his bed, dreaming of his imminent promotion to Chief Executive Officer, a separate covert team had bypassed the corporate security at Cole Enterprises. They had physically breached Derek's corner office on the 40th floor. They did not just bug his phone lines, they planted a direct hardware-level monitoring device straight into the motherboard of his computer tower. Every keystroke he made, every hidden account he accessed, and every private message he sent to his offshore accomplices was now being simultaneously mirrored and transmitted directly to Jonathan's forensic accountants. Derek had spent 3 years building digital firewalls to keep me out of my own company. Jonathan's team had just bypassed them, completely turning Derek's inner sanctum into a glass box where he was totally exposed. But the most critical piece of the operation was the destination itself. The remote mountain cabin in Lake Tahoe was supposed to be my final resting place. It was an isolated, sprawling wooden retreat surrounded by towering pines miles away from nosy neighbors and fast medical response teams. Derek and Patty had chosen it specifically for its severe isolation. Jonathan confirmed that a highly specialized advanced tactical team had been flown out on a private charter plane the night before. They had spent the entire night wiring the Tahoe property from top to bottom. They placed hidden cameras in the main living area, the kitchen, where Patty would undoubtedly prepare my final meals, and the master suite where they expected my heart to completely fail. They even rigged the exterior perimeter, ensuring we had a clear, undeniable view of the driveway and the surrounding woods. If Derek planned to orchestrate a medical emergency, or if they intended to actively facilitate my demise, every single second of their lethal performance would be broadcast live to our secure command center. They thought they were luring me into a secluded trap where no one could hear my final breath. Instead, they were walking directly onto a fully lit soundstage, and I was the director silently watching their every move from behind the heavy velvet curtain. The lead technician in my living room quietly packed away his specialized tools and snapped his briefcase shut. He approached me, handing over a sleek, heavily encrypted tablet. He explained the interface, showing me how to toggle instantly between the high-definition video feeds and the enhanced audio channels across all 3 locations. The resolution was absolutely breathtaking. I could see the microscopic dust motes floating in my own kitchen, and I could hear the faint ambient hum of the refrigerator. The entire process at the estate had taken less than 45 minutes. The team exited the house exactly as they had arrived, leaving absolutely zero physical trace of their presence. They vanished down the driveway, completely melting away into the quiet suburban morning. I stood alone in the grand foyer, holding the tablet in my trembling hands. I walked slowly through the house, marveling at the fact that my own home was now a fully weaponized surveillance grid. I was no longer a blind, trusting husband, living in blissful ignorance. I was an omniscient observer, armed with the ultimate truth. 20 minutes later, the front door swung open. Patty walked in carrying expensive bags from designer boutiques. Her cheeks were flushed from the warm Texas air, and she wore a vibrant, flawless smile. I quickly tucked the encrypted tablet safely out of sight. I slowly lowered myself back onto the living room sofa, immediately adopting the shallow, labored breathing of a dying man. I let my shoulders slump, forcing my face to project deep, painful exhaustion. She rushed over, dropping her bags, kneeling beside me to softly caress my cheek. She asked how I was feeling. I looked into her beautiful, treacherous eyes, knowing an invisible camera was recording this exact moment. I told her I was just trying to conserve my strength for the drive tomorrow. Patty stroked my hair with a gentle, soothing rhythm, her touch feeling like the cold slide of a serpent. She spoke in hushed, comforting tones, promising me that the mountain air would restore my vitality. I closed my eyes, leaning into the deception, allowing her to believe her maternal, caring performance was flawless. When she finally left the room to unpack her luxury purchases, I opened my eyes. The encrypted tablet hidden beneath the sofa cushion vibrated once. A message from Jonathan had safely arrived. I retrieved the device and walked slowly toward my private study, locking the heavy mahogany door behind me. The screen displayed a single, highly secured file transfer. Jonathan had spent the last 8 hours tearing through the deepest, most obscured archives of state and federal records. He had deployed a team of elite private investigators to unearth the buried history of Patricia Cole long before she became the matriarch of my sprawling corporate empire. I initiated the decryption sequence, watching the progress bar fill with a sense of creeping dread. I knew the truth waiting inside would be truly devastating. The document opened to reveal a scanned, yellowing birth certificate from a rural clinic in eastern Texas dated nearly 40 years ago. The mother listed on the faded paper was a young woman named Patricia Ann Miller, the maiden name of my wife. I stared at the stark, undeniable proof of a secret life she had completely erased. She had been 19 years old, unmarried, and desperate to escape the suffocating poverty of her hometown. She had carried a child in absolute secrecy, hiding the pregnancy from everyone who knew her. The true father was listed as entirely unknown locally. The next page contained the finalized sealed adoption records. Patricia had relinquished her maternal rights mere hours after the delivery, handing the infant boy over to the state foster system. She had traded her child for a clean slate, a chance to reinvent herself, and eventually charm her way into my life and my fortune. But the most horrifying detail was not the abandonment itself. It was the name of the couple who had formally adopted the boy 6 months later. They were a middle-class family from a modest Dallas suburb. Their legal last name was explicitly listed while Lawson. I traced the timeline downward, my finger trembling against the smooth glass of the tablet screen. The boy had been legally christened Derek Lawson, my brilliant, ambitious chief financial officer, the man who had married my beautiful daughter and charmed his way into the highest echelons of my corporate empire. the man actively plotting to stop my heart with a lethal chemical cocktail. He was not just a greedy son-in-law looking for an easy payday. Derek was her true biological son, her firstborn child, the secret flesh and blood she had mercilessly abandoned 40 years ago in Texas. A sudden violent wave of nausea washed over me, forcing me to grip the edge of my heavy wooden desk to remain standing. The sickening logic of their entire conspiracy rapidly clicked into place, forming a picture so depraved it defied all human comprehension. They were not secret lovers. They were mother and son. I remembered the day Derek first entered our lives 10 years ago. He had orchestrated a seemingly accidental meeting with Rachel at a prestigious charity gala downtown. I had thought it was simply fate, a lucky encounter between two ambitious young professionals seeking meaningful romantic connections. It was never fate. It was a flawless, meticulously engineered introduction designed by Patricia. She had successfully tracked down the son she abandoned, entirely bypassing the sealed adoption records. She had watched him grow into a calculating, hungry adult, and she had recognized a perfect reflection of her own ruthless ambition. Instead of a tearful private reunion, she had recruited him for a massive decade-long con. She deliberately guided Derek into the orbit of Rachel, actively encouraging the romance, aggressively manipulating my innocent daughter into marrying her own half-brother. The staggering evil of that act shattered my mind. Patricia had knowingly sacrificed the sanity and soul of our daughter to consolidate the bloodline and seize total control of the family wealth. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every loving toast at their wedding reception had been an elaborate, sickening stage play. I thought of Rachel, my sweet, trusting girl, sharing a bed with a monster who shared the DNA of her own mother. My wife had transformed our family into a twisted, incestuous nightmare, solely to steal $73 million and inherit a vast commercial real estate empire. The depth of this horrific corporate theft was staggering. This was a profound generational sickness. Patricia never loved me, and she certainly never loved Rachel. She viewed us merely as wealthy hosts, temporary vessels to be bled dry until her true chosen heir was properly positioned to inherit the throne. Derek executing rapid corporate ascension, gaining unchecked access to the deepest financial reserves, and making an aggressive push for international mergers were all carefully orchestrated by the woman sleeping in my bed. She had used her intimate knowledge of my business habits to guide him, ensuring his embezzlement remained entirely invisible to my blind executive board of directors today. The lethal vitamins were simply the final act of this grand, horrific production. Patricia needed me eliminated before the independent corporate audit exposed the massive offshore accounts she heavily funded. Once I suffered my tragic sudden heart attack in the remote Tahoe cabin, Derek would inherit the leadership of Cole Enterprises. He would use my $50 million life insurance policy to quietly replace the stolen reserves. He and Patricia would then control the entire estate, completely cutting Rachel out of any meaningful operational power. They would rule the empire together, a united mother and son reigning supreme there forever. I locked the tablet and placed it inside the hidden safe behind my bookshelf. The silence of the study pressed against my ears, heavy and absolute. I was a man standing in the smoldering ruins of his own existence, surrounded by ghosts and vipers. The love I had felt for my wife for 35 years was instantly incinerated, replaced by a cold, radiating fury that burned hotter than the surface of the sun. I had originally intended to simply ruin them financially, to strip them of their stolen wealth and cast them out into the unforgiving, dark city streets. But financial ruin was far too merciful a punishment for the unspeakable, horrifying atrocities they had committed against my innocent daughter. I walked toward the heavy oak door of the study, my breathing perfectly calm, my hands absolutely steady. The dying swan act was now completely over. Tomorrow morning we would board the private jet and fly to the isolated mountain cabin in Lake Tahoe. They believed they were leading a blind, dying old man to his quiet, inevitable slaughter. They had absolutely no idea they were walking directly into the brutal, unforgiving jaws of my truly perfect ultimate revenge. The flight from Dallas to the private airstrip near Lake Tahoe was a masterpiece of silent psychological warfare. I sat securely strapped into the plush leather seat of my executive jet, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, staring out the window at the endless expanse of white clouds. Patty sat across from me sipping sparkling water and casually flipping through a glossy fashion magazine. Derek was near the front of the cabin, loudly reviewing quarterly financial projections on his phone, expertly playing the role of the dedicated corporate soldier. They completely ignored me for most of the 3-hour flight. To them, I was already a ghost fading into the background. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing, deliberately slowing my heart rate, perfecting the illusion of a man rapidly declining into the twilight of his life. When we finally landed, the crisp, thin mountain air hit my lungs like a sheet of ice. The weather forecast had predicted a moderate winter storm, but as our rented luxury vehicle wound its way up the treacherous mountain roads, the sky bruised into a deep, violent gray. The temperature plummeted rapidly as we climbed higher into the frozen, remote wilderness. I gripped a polished wooden walking cane, an antique I had pulled from my study before leaving Dallas. I leaned heavily on it as I stepped out of the vehicle and onto the gravel driveway of the cabin. The property was a magnificent structure of dark timber and river stone, sitting on 30 acres of dense, untouched pine forest. It was usually my own absolute favorite place in the world. Today it felt like a beautifully constructed wooden tomb. Derek rushed to my side, gripping my elbow with a firm, utterly false display of supportive strength and fake familial concern. He guided me carefully up the front steps, constantly reminding me to take my time and breathe deeply. I allowed my hand to tremble against the handle of the wooden cane, shuffling my feet slowly across the wooden planks of the porch. I coughed a dry, rattling sound that I forcefully pushed up from the bottom of my chest. Patty hurried ahead to unlock the heavy front door, her face a mask of deeply concerned devotion. She ushered us into the grand living room, immediately turning up the central thermostat and rushing to light a fire in the massive hearth. I collapsed onto the large leather sofa, closing my eyes and letting my head fall back against the soft cushions. The physical exertion of maintaining the dying swan act was utterly exhausting, but the sheer adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me razor-sharp. By late afternoon, the moderate winter storm had aggressively mutated into a massive blinding blizzard. The wind began to howl fiercely through the tall pines, violently shaking the thick glass of the cabin windows. The snow fell in heavy, impenetrable sheets, rapidly burying the driveway and completely erasing the winding mountain road that connected us together. We were entirely cut off from civilization. No vehicles could possibly make it up the treacherous mountain, and no one could safely make it down. The local news broadcast on the television sternly warned all residents to stay indoors and prepare for a prolonged period of severe isolation. I sat by the roaring fire, staring blankly at the dancing orange flames. The isolation created a suffocating claustrophobic tension inside the spacious cabin. I was trapped in a remote wooden box with a mother and son who were actively, methodically conspiring to end my life before the cold, new week began. Yet beneath the surface of my feigned vulnerability, I felt a deep, profound sense of operational comfort. I knew that Rachel and my grandchildren were completely safe hundreds of miles away in the warm security of their Dallas home. I had specifically insisted they stay behind, citing the harsh weather and my desperate need for quiet rest. Derek and Patty had eagerly agreed, likely thrilled, that there would be absolutely no unexpected witnesses to my tragic impending medical emergency. The knowledge that Jonathan Briggs and his elite security team were watching my every single move provided a strong, silent shield. I knew that hidden behind the mounted stag head above the stone mantel, a microscopic camera was flawlessly recording the room. I knew that a tiny audio transmitter planted in the kitchen lighting fixture was capturing every hushed, treacherous conversation. We were cut off from the physical world, but we were entirely connected to a secure digital command center where my loyal protectors sat heavily armed with the absolute truth. I was the bait willingly stepping into the deadly lion den, But the hungry lions had absolutely no idea the steel cage door had already been securely locked behind them. As the evening sky turned a dark, bruised black, the cabin settled into a tense, suffocating routine. Patty moved around the open kitchen, preparing a rich, heavy dinner. The delicious smell of roasted meats and savory herbs filled the warm indoor air. I watched her from my spot on the sofa, quietly observing the meticulous care she put into her final culinary performance. Derek sat at the heavy wooden dining table, supposedly reviewing complex legal documents, but I could clearly feel his predatory gaze constantly darting toward my resting body. They were both patiently waiting for the inevitable bitter end. They were patiently waiting for the invisible poison they believed was coursing through my veins to finally take its catastrophic toll on my heart. Patty walked into the living room carrying a steaming mug of dark herbal tea. She knelt gracefully beside the sofa, her face a perfect picture of maternal loving concern. She held the mug out to me softly, urging me to drink it, claiming the warm herbs would soothe my chest and calm my erratic pulse. I took the mug with violently shaking hands, feeling the intense heat radiate straight through the thick, warm, decorative ceramic walls. I knew exactly what was hiding inside. I knew that beneath the fragrant scent of chamomile and mint lay the invisible, lethal dose of beta blockers and synthetic stimulants meant to stop my heart forever. I brought the rim to my lips, blowing gently on the surface of the dark liquid. I did not drink it. I merely pretended to take a small, hesitant sip, carefully, letting the hot tea simply wet my lips before slowly lowering the mug back to my lap. I closed my eyes again, feigning a sudden overwhelming wave of terrible dizziness and deep physical weakness. I let out a low-pained groan, gripping my chest tightly with my free hand. Derek immediately stood up from the dining table, his heavy wooden chair scraping loudly against the polished floorboards. He walked over to the sofa, standing directly behind his mother, his eyes locked onto my face with a terrifying absolute intensity. The blizzard raged fiercely outside the cabin, the wind screaming against the heavy timber walls like a chorus of angry ghosts. The fire cracked and popped in the stone hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. I opened my eyes slightly, looking directly forward. Derek was standing rigid, his breathing shallow, waiting for the final collapse. I let out a long, shuddering exhale and let my body go completely limp against the leather cushions. I closed my eyes, entirely slowing my breath until it was barely perceptible. I heard Patty gasp a sharp intake of air that sounded far too theatrical to be genuine. Derek stepped closer, his heavy shadow falling across my face. He stood there for a long moment, simply watching me, testing the waters to see if I was truly gone or just unconscious. I did not move. I did not flinch. Eventually, the tension in the room broke. Derek let out a low, victorious sigh, turning back to his mother. They did not speak, but the ambient hum of their shared relief was palpable. They helped me up, playing the role of concerned caretakers, and practically carried me to the master bedroom on the second floor. They tucked me under the heavy down comforters, turned off the lights, and quietly shut the door. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, where I knew Jonathan's hidden camera was blinking with a tiny, invisible red light. The storm outside raged through Friday and into Saturday. I remained confined to the bed, eating nothing, drinking except the bottled water I had secretly smuggled in my luggage. I poured the poisoned teas and toxic vitamins they brought me directly down the master bathroom sink. By Saturday evening, the blizzard had reached a terrifying crescendo. The wind battered the heavy timber walls of the cabin, piling snowdrifts halfway up the first-floor windows. We were completely entombed in a frozen white wasteland. At 9 exactly, Patty brought me what she assumed would be my final dose of the lethal medication. She sat on the edge of the mattress, gently stroking my forehead, whispering that the storm would pass soon, and everything would be peaceful. Her eyes were hollow, devoid of any genuine human empathy. She was simply going through the motions, checking the final boxes on her murder checklist. I took the capsules with a violently shaking hand, pretending to swallow them dry before coughing weakly. She smiled a chilling, genuine expression of impending triumph and quietly left the room. I waited for the heavy wooden door to click shut. The moment the latch caught, the frail, dying old man vanished entirely. I stood up from the bed, my legs steady and strong. I walked into the adjoining bathroom, spat the capsules into the toilet, and flushed them away. I walked over to my leather travel bag and pulled out a crystal tumbler and a small sealed flask of 20-year-old single malt whiskey. I poured myself a generous, neat measure. The rich amber liquid glowed in the dim light of the bedroom. It was time. I walked over to the heavy bedroom door and opened it with absolute terrifying silence. The thick carpets of the second-floor hallway muffled my footsteps as I approached the grand wooden staircase. I stood in the shadows of the landing, looking down into the massive vaulted living room. The fire was roaring in the stone hearth, casting long dancing shadows across the expensive leather furniture. Patty and Derek were sitting together on the large sofa, bathed in the warm, flickering light. They were no longer playing the roles of the worried wife and the dedicated son-in-law. They were celebrating. Derek held a bottle of expensive vintage champagne, peeling away the gold foil with eager, trembling fingers. Patty was holding 2 crystal flutes, her face flushed with the thrill of their magnificent victory. I stood completely still, listening to the crystal-clear audio of their conversation, echoing up the stairwell. Derek popped the cork, the celebratory sound sharp and crisp against the howling wind outside. He poured the bubbling liquid into the flutes, handing one to the woman who had birthed him. He raised his glass, offering a toast to $50 million of untraceable, completely tax-free capital. Patty clinked her glass against his, letting out a bright, joyful laugh that made my blood run entirely cold. She told him that the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were fully primed and ready to receive the influx of clean cash. She praised his brilliant financial maneuvering, telling him how incredibly proud she was of his ruthless corporate ascension. They were completely intoxicated by their own perceived genius, entirely unaware that their every word, every laugh, and every clink of crystal was being broadcast directly to an elite team of forensic lawyers and security specialists in Dallas. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the smooth burn of the single malt whiskey coat the back of my throat. I gripped the antique wooden cane in my left hand, stepping out of the shadows and onto the top step of the grand staircase. I did not shuffle. I did not slump my shoulders. I descended the stairs with the slow, powerful, and deliberate cadence of a king reclaiming his absolute throne. The heavy, rhythmic thud of my leather shoes against the hardwood steps cut through their celebratory laughter like a gunshot. Derek froze mid-sentence, his champagne flute hovering inches from his mouth. Patty snapped her head toward the staircase, her eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated terror. I reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped into the warm glow of the firelight. I looked at their pale, shocked faces. I raised my left arm, holding the wooden cane in the air, for a brief, suspended moment, and then I casually tossed it aside. The heavy wood clattered loudly against the stone floor, rolling away into the shadows. I stood perfectly straight, my posture rigid, projecting absolute dominating power. I took a slow, appreciative sip of my neat whiskey, letting the silence stretch until it became physically agonizing for them. I looked directly into Patty's wide, trembling eyes. "Your vitamins are remarkably ineffective, Patty," I said, my voice smooth, deep, and devoid of any weakness. "Or should I call you Derek's mother?" The crystal champagne flute slipped from Patty's lifeless fingers, shattering into 100 glittering pieces against the polished floorboards. The bubbling liquid pooled around her expensive shoes, but she did not even look down. All the color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. Derek stumbled backward, dropping his own glass, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His polished, arrogant corporate veneer instantly disintegrated, leaving behind nothing but a scared, cornered animal. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us. The firelight danced across the room, illuminating the sheer, absolute devastation on their faces. "You really thought I was just a blind, clueless old man," I continued, my voice echoing off the high timber ceilings. "You thought you could slowly poison me, steal $73 million from my reserves, and quietly bury my empire in a remote mountain cabin. You thought your little offshore shell companies and your pathetic forged signatures were completely invisible to my own watchful eyes. You thought your little offshore shell companies and your pathetic forged signatures were completely invisible to my own watchful eyes." The heavy, suffocating silence that followed my cold words was so absolute, it felt as though the very air in the dark cabin had instantly frozen solid. Patty stared at me, her chest heaving, the shattered crystal of her champagne flute glinting against the dark floorboards. For a fraction of a second, she tried to cling to the illusion. She opened her mouth, her face twisting into a mask of desperate performative confusion, preparing to deny everything. But she looked into my eyes and saw the absolute, uncompromising truth reflected back at her. The fragile facade cracked. Then it violently shattered. The elegant, doting wife I had known and loved for over 3 decades completely vanished, replaced by a stranger with eyes full of pure, concentrated venom. Her posture straightened, the trembling fear dissolving into a cold, hard defiance. She let out a loud laugh that was sharp and utterly devoid of humor, a chilling sound that scraped against the stone walls of the isolated room. "You know," she hissed, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that I had never heard before. "I spent 35 years playing the perfect supportive companion. I smiled at your tedious corporate dinners. I managed your massive, suffocating estate. I sacrificed my youth, my freedom, and my own identity to be a beautiful accessory to your grand empire." She stepped forward, kicking aside a shard of broken glass. "And what was the reward for my lifelong servitude? A comfortable allowance while you groomed your precious, pathetic daughter to inherit the entire kingdom. Rachel is weak, Harrison. She is soft, utterly naive, and completely unfit to manage the wealth you spent your life hoarding. She would let the company crumble within a decade." She gestured sharply toward Derek, who was still standing frozen by the leather sofa. "Derek is brilliant. He has my ambition, my drive, my blood. He earned that empire. He built the international mergers while you sat comfortably in your executive chair taking all the credit. I found my true son, the flesh and blood I was forced to abandon because I had nothing, and I gave him the world you tried to deny us. We orchestrated everything. We guided your foolish daughter right into his arms. We wove him into the very fabric of your business. We took what was rightfully ours, and we were finally going to take the rest." I listened to her horrific confession without moving a single muscle. The sheer depth of her depravity was staggering, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing my pain. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my whiskey, savoring the rich burn against my throat. "Your sense of entitlement is truly breathtaking, Patricia," I replied, my voice steady and resonant. "You did not earn anything. You orchestrated a sick, twisted psychological torture upon an innocent girl. You manipulated your own child into a fraudulent marriage just to steal from the man who gave you everything. But your brilliant plan has a fatal flaw." I smiled, a tight, cold expression. "You assume you have already won. You assume those Cayman Island accounts actually belong to you." I paused, letting the reality slowly dawn on them. I transferred every single asset, every commercial property, and every share of Cole Enterprises into an irrevocable blind trust yesterday morning. Rachel is the sole beneficiary. Your fraudulent offshore accounts have been identified and frozen by federal investigators. Your entire financial architecture has been completely dismantled. You are standing in the middle of nowhere, celebrating a victory that does not exist. You possess absolutely nothing. The color drained from Derek's face. The polished, arrogant chief financial officer who had confidently poured champagne just moments ago was entirely gone. He scrambled toward his leather briefcase resting on the coffee table, his hands shaking wildly as he tore open the brass clasps. He pulled out a satellite phone, frantically punching in numbers to check his offshore balances. I watched him listen to the automated response, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated panic as he realized the funds were gone. The accounts were locked. He dropped the heavy phone, the device clattering loudly against the wooden floor. He looked at his mother, his chest heaving with rapid, terrified breaths. "He knows everything," Derek stammered, his voice climbing in pitch. "The money is gone. The trust is sealed. If he makes it out of this cabin, we are going to federal prison for the rest of our natural lives. All the embezzlement, the wire fraud, the forged documents, he has it all documented. We are completely ruined." Patty turned to her son, her face pale, but her eyes flashing with a desperate, dark determination. "We are not ruined, Derek," she snapped, her voice slicing through his rising panic. "He is just one old man. We are isolated in a blizzard. No one can reach us and no one can save him. Look at him. He is entirely alone. The natural heart attack plan is obviously ruined, but there are other ways to solve this problem. We just need to eliminate the source of the threat." She looked back at me, her gaze lingering on the heavy wooden cane I had tossed aside. "We will simply say he confronted us in a violent, manic state. We will claim self-defense. Or better yet, a tragic, violent home invasion." Derek stared at her, the realization of what she was suggesting washing over him. The sophisticated corporate thief was quickly transforming into a trapped, violent, cornered animal. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and slowly reached inside the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. When his hand emerged, he was holding a sleek black suppressed handgun. The long cylindrical silencer attached to the barrel absorbed the flickering light of the fireplace, casting a deadly, unnatural shadow across the room. He pointed the weapon directly at my chest, his hand trembling slightly at first, then steadying as his survival instinct fully took over. The sophisticated executive was gone, replaced entirely by a desperate killer, ready to murder his own father-in-law to protect his stolen life. "You should have just stayed in bed and let the medication do its work, Harrison," Derek said, his voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper. "It would have been peaceful. You would have drifted off to sleep and everyone would have remembered you as a great man who simply worked his heart too hard. Now it is going to be messy. A tragic home invasion during a terrible winter storm. A masked intruder breaking in looking for valuables, shooting the beloved patriarch before fleeing back into the blizzard. It is a terrible tragedy, but it solves all of our problems. Once you are dead, I will find a way to break that blind trust. I will hire an army of corporate litigators and drag Rachel through the courts until she surrenders. I will take back what is mine. You will absolutely never stand in my way again, old man." I looked down the barrel of the suppressed handgun, feeling absolutely no fear. Derek gripped the weapon with desperate intensity, his knuckles white, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He expected me to drop to my knees and plead for the life he desperately wanted to extinguish. He craved the satisfaction of seeing me reduced to a trembling, pathetic victim. Instead, I simply smiled. It was a cold, hollow expression that unnerved him even more than my silence. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. Derek flinched, tightening his finger over the trigger, shouting at me to keep my hands where he could see them. I ignored his frantic commands. I pulled out a thick leather dossier and casually tossed it onto the polished coffee table. It landed with a definitive thud, sliding to a halt next to the shattered remains of Patty's crystal champagne flute. "Go ahead and shoot me, Derek," I said, my voice resonating through the silent cabin. "Pull the trigger. But before you do, you need to know 3 facts about your situation. First, your brilliant home invasion narrative is already dead. This cabin is currently live streaming video and clear audio to a secure command center in Dallas. Jonathan Briggs is sitting in a room with federal agents and my entire legal team. They watched your entire performance tonight. They saw you pour the champagne, heard your mother confess to your twisted, incestuous origin, and are currently watching you point a suppressed firearm directly at my chest. If you pull that trigger, you are not committing a clever murder in the isolated woods. You are starring in a live broadcast of your own federal execution." Derek's eyes darted around the room, scanning the ceiling, the hearth, and the mounted stag head, suddenly realizing the invisible trap I had built. His hand began to shake uncontrollably, the heavy weapon drooping toward the floor. Second, I continued taking a step forward, forcing him to shrink back. You are completely bankrupt. You thought your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were secure. You thought you were a financial genius. But Jonathan is far smarter than you will ever be. At exactly 5 o'clock this evening, while you were busy trying to force beta blockers down my throat, a team of forensic accountants executed a digital repatriation protocol. Every single dollar of the $15 million you stashed in those Caribbean shell companies was legally seized and transferred into a charitable foundation for at-risk youth. The $73 million you embezzled from the corporate reserves has already been fully recovered by federal authorities. You are holding a gun ready to commit murder for absolutely nothing. Your mother's decade-long con has yielded you $0. You are exactly what you were when she abandoned you 40 years ago. Nothing. Patty let out a horrific scream, lunging toward the coffee table to grab the dossier, desperate to find some proof that I was lying. She tore open the flap, her eyes scanning the official bank transfer confirmations and the sealed court orders. The reality of her absolute failure washed over her, and she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing into her hands. Derek stood completely paralyzed, his mind unable to process the magnitude of his defeat. He looked at the gun in his hand, then looked at the front door, contemplating a suicidal escape into the blizzard. And the third thing I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Before I could finish the sentence, the front door of the cabin was violently kicked open. The reinforced timber splintered inward with a deafening crash, letting in a swirling vortex of freezing white snow and howling wind. 6 armed private security contractors swarmed into the grand living room, moving with terrifying synchronized speed. They wore tactical gear and carried compact assault rifles. Before Derek could even raise his weapon, 2 operatives slammed into him, tackling him brutally to the hardwood floor. The suppressed handgun clattered uselessly across the room. They pinned his arms behind his back, securing his wrists with heavy zip ties, pressing his face forcefully against the floorboards. 2 other operatives flanked Patty, pulling her roughly to her feet and securing her hands while she continued to scream and thrash wildly. The chaotic flurry of violence ended in less than 10 seconds. The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the sound of the raging blizzard blowing through the shattered doorway. Jonathan Briggs stepped through the broken frame, shaking the snow from his winter coat. He looked down at Derek and Patty with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He gave me a sharp nod, confirming that the entire operation had been flawlessly executed, and federal authorities were officially on their way. But Jonathan was not the last person to walk through the door. A smaller figure stepped out of the freezing darkness and into the warm glow of the cabin firelight. It was Rachel. My beautiful, brilliant daughter stood in the center of the shattered room, wearing a thick wool coat, her face pale but her posture absolutely rigid. She did not look at me. She did not look at Jonathan. Her eyes were locked entirely on Derek, who was currently writhing on the floor, struggling against the heavy plastic bindings. Derek looked up at her, his face twisted in a desperate mask of terror. "Rachel," he pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "Rachel, please, you have to listen to me. He is lying. He is setting us up." Rachel slowly walked forward, stopping just a few feet away from the man she had called her husband. She looked down at him, her expression completely devoid of any love, any warmth, or any pity. She looked at him as if he were a poisonous insect crawling across her floor. I watched her face, seeing the profound realization of the ultimate betrayal settling into her bones. She had been sitting in the secure command center in Dallas for the last 4 hours. She had watched the live video feeds. She had heard every single word of their celebratory, incestuous conversation over the hidden audio transmitters. She knew that the man she married was her own secret half-brother. She knew that the mother she loved had engineered the entire sickening relationship just to steal the family wealth. "Do not ever speak my name again," Rachel said, her voice eerily calm and resonant with newly discovered strength. "You make me sick to my stomach. Both of you." She slowly turned to look at Patty, who was weeping uncontrollably in the grip of the security operatives. "You are not my mother. You are a monster. You traded my soul and my sanity for money, and now you have absolutely nothing to show for it. I want you both out of my sight forever." She turned her back on them, walking over to where I stood. She wrapped her arms around me, burying her face in my shoulder. I held my daughter tightly, feeling her trembling slightly, but knowing she was finally truly safe. The deadly poison had been completely extracted from our lives. I did not flinch at the suppressed weapon. I slowly reached inside my coat and pulled out a thick leather dossier, tossing it onto the coffee table. "Shoot me, Derek," I said, my voice echoing through the cabin. "But know 3 things. First, this cabin is currently live streaming to the FBI and my lawyers. Second, the $15 million you stashed in Cayman was digitally repatriated to a charity fund at 5 today. And third, before I could finish, the heavy front door was violently kicked open. The timber splintered inward, letting in a blinding vortex of freezing snow. Armed private security contractors swarmed the grand room, followed closely by Jonathan Briggs and my beautiful daughter Rachel. They moved with absolute uncompromising authority. Derek offered no physical resistance. The sheer shock of his defeat had completely hollowed him out. A federal agent read him his rights explicitly, listing the charges of attempted murder, massive corporate embezzlement, and federal wire fraud. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a definitive finality. He stared blankly at the shattered floorboards as they dragged him out into the freezing, howling winter storm. Rachel stared at her husband and her mother with utter disgust. She had heard every single word of their incestuous, murderous plot over the live feed. With Derek gone, the room's gravity shifted to the woman kneeling in the center of the living room. Patty watched her biological son being marched into the blizzard, the reality of her shattered master plan, breaking her iron composure. She turned toward us, her face streaked with ruined makeup and frantic tears. She scrambled across the polished wood, reaching out to grab the hem of my coat. She begged us both for mercy. She cried out that she had been confused, that Derek had manipulated her, weaving a pathetic web of lies right in front of the daughter she had so ruthlessly sacrificed. Rachel stood perfectly still, her face carved from solid ice, looking down at the woman who had orchestrated a decade of psychological torture. Patty reached for Rachel's hand, sobbing hysterically, pleading for the sacred bond of a mother and daughter. Rachel simply took a slow step backward, removing herself entirely from Patty's desperate reach. I looked down at the woman I had shared a bed with for 35 years. The anger inside me had burned itself out, leaving nothing but a frozen wasteland of absolute indifference. I pulled my coat tightly around my shoulders and looked her directly in the eyes. "You do not exist anymore," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet resonating with absolute finality. I turned my back on her weeping form and walked past her, guiding Rachel toward the warmth of the roaring fire. The federal agents lifted Patty from the floor, ignoring her frantic screams as they marched her out of my life forever. 6 months passed, and the winter snows melted away, taking the darkest shadows of our lives with them. The legal fallout from that night in the Tahoe cabin was swift and utterly merciless. Derek was immediately denied bail, deemed a severe flight risk due to his intimate knowledge of international banking systems. The mountain of digital evidence Jonathan Briggs had carefully extracted from his corporate computer, combined with the pristine audio and video recordings of his full confession, left his defense attorneys completely paralyzed. He pleaded guilty to avoid a highly publicized spectacle, but the federal judge showed absolutely no leniency whatsoever. He was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The brilliant executive who had sought to completely conquer a global real estate empire was now confined to a small concrete cell, stripped of his wealth, his status, and his freedom. Patty faced an equally devastating, albeit entirely different form of absolute ruin. She had arrogantly assumed that despite the shocking criminal charges brought against her, her status as my legal wife would afford her some significant measure of financial protection, during the inevitable, highly publicized divorce proceedings. She was tragically mistaken. When we were married over 3 decades ago, I had insisted on a highly specific, extremely comprehensive prenuptial agreement. Jonathan had recently dusted off that ancient document and eagerly triggered a heavily buried ironclad clause regarding documented felony fraud and intentional spousal endangerment. The powerful legal provision instantly and irrevocably voided any and all claims to spousal support, shared property, or corporate equity. The courts moved with staggering, unprecedented speed, permanently freezing her personal accounts and forcefully evicting her from the massive Preston Hollow estate. The woman who had so ruthlessly plotted to steal $73 million was left entirely destitute, suddenly forced to rely on overworked court-appointed public defenders and the meager charity of distant relatives who thoroughly despised her. She was swiftly cast out of the pristine kingdom she had tried to steal, forever banished, to the bleak, unforgiving margins of a society she once proudly ruled. The most profound transformation, however, did not merely occur within the strict federal prison system or the chaotic civil courts. It happened directly right beside me. Rachel finalized her divorce from Derek with surgical, utterly emotionless precision. The naive, trusting young woman who had been so cruelly manipulated by her own family died that night in the freezing mountain cabin. In her place, a strong, remarkably sharp, and fiercely independent corporate leader was born. She threw herself into the daily operations of coal enterprises, mastering the complex financial architecture with a burning, relentless dedication. She learned to spot the subtle, hidden liabilities in commercial contracts, and she developed an incredibly sharp intuition for reading the true intentions of our corporate partners. I watched her navigate aggressive boardroom negotiations with a cold, brilliant efficiency that made me incredibly proud. She was no longer the vulnerable heir waiting in the wings. She was a hardened veteran who had survived the absolute worst form of betrayal and emerged utterly unbroken. We stood together on the top floor of our Dallas corporate headquarters, the massive glass windows offering a sweeping panoramic view of the sprawling city below. The bright afternoon sun reflected off the towering skyscrapers illuminating the vast commercial empire we had fought so desperately to protect. The boardroom behind us was quiet, the heavy mahogany table clear of the treacherous shadows that had haunted us for so long. The systemic, cancerous rot had been meticulously identified and completely cut out. The staggering offshore funds had been fully recovered, securely locked back into the primary company reserves, fortifying our foundation for the coming decades. I placed a hand gently on Rachel's shoulder, feeling the solid, confident strength in her posture. She turned to me, offering a genuine, peaceful smile that finally reached her eyes. The nightmare was truly over. We had faced the ultimate betrayal from the people we trusted most, and we had systematically dismantled their grand conspiracy with flawless, devastating precision. Our legacy was secure, our wealth was protected, and the future of our family enterprise was finally in the right hands. The great empire had survived the darkest storm, and it was now far stronger, sharper, and absolutely invincible. Sometimes the people who smile the brightest at your dinner table are the ones secretly measuring you for a coffin. Loyalty isn't determined by marriage certificates or decades of shared history. It is proven in the dark when people think no one is watching. I built an empire with my hands, but my greatest achievement was having the courage to burn down my own perfect world to protect the only person who truly mattered, my daughter. Never let your love for your family blind you to their actions. When the wolves are already inside the house, you have to become the apex predator. Have you ever trusted someone completely only to find out they were wearing a mask the entire time? How did you survive that ultimate betrayal? Drop your story in the comments below. Hit that subscribe button for more untold truths, and remember, always trust your gut.